We are still awaiting the full results of Monday's Iowa caucus, but the candidates are already hitting the trail in New Hampshire, site of next week's primary. Let's bring in our Caitlin Huey-Burns. She's a CBSN political reporter, and she's in Manchester, New Hampshire. Caitlin, thanks for being with us. You've been following Bernie Sanders in New Hampshire. Today, the Vermont senator made some extended comments on impeachment. Let's listen to part of what he said.
What is significant is if Trump is able to get away with it, and I fear very much that he will, because we don't have enough Republicans in the Senate who have the courage to do what many of them know is right. If Trump gets away with this, I want you to appreciate the precedent that is being established.
So, Caitlin, is this language from Sanders part of a larger messaging campaign in New Hampshire?
Well, it's pretty remarkable that he started off his event today referencing that. You had Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar leaving New Hampshire today to make it back to Washington for that vote. And what's interesting to me is that you and I have talked a lot about how voters haven't really been thinking about impeachment as a top of mind issue. But now we're in a different phase of that issue, because talking to voters here, listening to the candidates talk about impeachment and this vote in particular, the question now becomes, what will the impact be? And Bernie Sanders just there was trying to illustrate for the folks here in New Hampshire and elsewhere what abuse of power in his mind looks like and how that can translate not only to the president but to government at large. And so this is part of a pitch to really speak to voters. And I've been wondering myself whether this headline that the president is about to get with being exonerated by the Senate, whether that emboldens him and his supporters, what kind of effect that has on Democratic voters, whether that amps them up as well. I was talking to a couple voters at that New Hampshire event with Bernie Sanders, and they said that this is something they think can rally Democrats in November. And that's how the messaging is going to shift now. You're going to hear it from candidates after the exoneration of President Trump by the Senate. You're going to hear candidates talk about making this verdict at the ballot box in November, and a way to try to inspire people to show up for down ballot races and change the makeup of the U.S. Senate.
Well, Caitlin, I wonder, what do New Hampshire voters make of the results coming out of Iowa? Are they paying close attention to that?
Elaine, they are. They're watching that very closely. And, you know, there's that old adage made famous by the former New Hampshire governor a while ago that Iowa picks corn and New Hampshire picks president. So there is that long-standing rivalry between these two states, and that is even more pronounced this cycle. I've been asking voters at events here over the past 24 hours, have you been watching what's happening in Iowa? And they say, oh, yes, we've been watching. But remember, New Hampshire is a primary, and we're going to count those votes. So they're very proud of this fact that they have the first in the nation primary here in New Hampshire. And actually the candidates, however discouraged they are by how everything went down in Iowa, they are kind of using this as opening stump lines, using this as a joke. You heard Bernie Sanders today saying that they're still counting votes in Iowa, but in New Hampshire they're going to count all the votes. So this is something that voters are certainly paying attention to. And there was this question about whether voters here might be influenced by the results coming out of New Hampshire, and a lot of voters take pride in not taking cues from Iowa.
Interesting. All right. I also want to bring in Washington Post reporter Eugene Scott. Eugene, thanks for joining us. I want to talk about Pete Buttigieg. You wrote recently that voters in the Midwest want him to, quote, embrace a diverse view of the American heartland. And there's been some controversy, as you write, regarding this term American heartland. What can you tell us about that?
Well, heading into the Iowa caucus, Pete Buttigieg tweeted something about his appeal to American heartland values. And quite frankly, it worked for him. One of the reasons it appears that he is in the lead and possibly won the Iowa caucuses is because of his ability to appeal to more traditional, more conservative Democrats by campaigning in more rural areas and not being as progressive as some of the candidates, including Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, by really just advocating for for the conservatism of Midwest values. The challenge with the idea and the concept of Midwest values in American heartland to many Americans is that it appears to be a dog whistle in terms of being exclusive, not including the diversity not only of America but of the heartland specifically when it comes to people of color, religious minorities, LGBT communities, immigrants, and other marginalized communities. And so there was some pushback from people from those communities who are well populated and represented in the Midwest, hoping that Buttigieg's idea of the American heartland had room for them.
Well, Eugene, I want to play for you some sound from Buttigieg in New Hampshire, discussing what his campaign says was a successful Iowa caucus. Take a listen.
It validates for a kid somewhere in a community wondering if he belongs or she belongs or they belong in their own family. That if you believe in yourself and your country, there's a lot backing up that belief.
So, Eugene, how does the Buttigieg camp continue this momentum going ahead of the primary there next week?
Well, I think what this win for Buttigieg will allow his team to do is to make a stronger argument for the case of electability. The fact that an openly gay man won Iowa, a Midwestern state that's somewhat progressive in ways. It was the first state in the Midwest to pass same-sex marriage. But at the end of the day, it's a Midwestern state where family values are core. For an openly gay man to win that state, it's not insignificant. And for those voters who weren't sure that other states would back someone who represented something so non-traditional and unorthodox, what he's able to tell people is actually, I am electable, I can win, and I can make progress in states moving forward. Now, obviously, the big test will be South Carolina, a place where conservatism is more present within the Democratic Party than in Iowa and in New Hampshire. And we'll see how he shifts his campaign and his efforts regarding winning votes as he moves to a more traditional part of the country.
Well, Caitlin, former Vice President Joe Biden did not have the performance in Iowa that he had hoped for. Here's what he told supporters in New Hampshire earlier today.
I am not going to sugarcoat it. We took a gut punch in Iowa. The whole process took a gut punch. But look, this isn't the first time in my life I've been knocked down.
In that same speech, Biden also went after Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg. Caitlin, how does Biden plan to bounce back next week?
Yeah, that was a remarkable shift in his stump speech, not only going after Bernie Sanders by name, but now calling out Pete Buttigieg by name. And you can see why, as we're getting those results trickling in from Iowa. Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders look to be in the lead in terms of the delegate count. So this is an attempt by Biden to take a swipe at both of his rivals at the same time, calling them both risky bets, essentially. And that's been a key part of Biden's pitch to voters, that he is kind of the safe and reliable person that you can put in the White House and be able to do the job on day one. There are now lots of questions about Joe Biden's viability in this primary process, given that he appears to be in fourth place in Iowa. Now, his team had been managing expectations in Iowa since the beginning, saying that, look, those first two early states, New Hampshire and Iowa, are not indicative of the Democratic Party at large. Where Joe Biden's strengths lie are with a more diverse electorate, especially in Nevada and especially in South Carolina, which goes fourth in this contest and has a primary. There, he's doing very, very well with African-American voters, who are, of course, a key constituency there and in the Super Tuesday states and for the Democratic Party moving on. All Democrats say that you cannot form a winning coalition without African-American voters, and the Biden team knows that, and they count that as a strength. But after Iowa, and depending on how he does in New Hampshire, there is this question about whether that firewall that he has built up in those two states can still last. And so his attempts here in New Hampshire are to make this pitch again directly to voters.
Well, Eugene, I want to switch gears to President Trump's State of the Union address. In your latest piece, you write that the president made his most direct appeal to black voters yet. Here are some of those references the president made last night.
We are advancing with unbridled optimism and lifting our citizens of every race, color, religion, and creed. Our roaring economy has, for the first time ever, given many former prisoners the ability to get a great job and a fresh start.
So, Eugene, what is the president's current standing among black voters, and how could it help him politically to reach out to them?
Well, the president's approval rating with black voters, according to the Gallup poll, remains under 10%, which it has consistently been since he entered the Oval Office. But what the president knows is that while he enjoys significant approval with Republicans, about 94%, he has lost independents and swing voters, a group that was effective in helping deliver the White House to him in 2016. And so he has to try to win them back. But what he also has to try to do is nip away at the Democrats. And what he's doing is looking at the various constituencies that back Democrats and seeing which ones he can win. Now, most people would find it shocking to see that the president would even pursue black voters, considering how much they disapprove of him and so many of his headlines that have caused problems with him with black voters. But the reality is he actually has more to campaign on in 2020 than he did in 2016. And that's what he's done this week, highlighting his criminal justice record, highlighting low unemployment rates for black voters, pointing to some high-profile surrogates who have backed him, and also his work with Senator Tim Scott, the only black senator in the Republican Party, on opportunity zones, hoping to improve underserved communities in urban and some rural areas that have large black populations. And he's hoping states like North Carolina, states like Michigan and Pennsylvania give him about 1% to 2% of the black vote. And he really made a run for that, a case for that at the State of the Union address. But more importantly, what I believe the president is doing in his black voter outreach is what he's done in much of his black voter outreach. He's trying to signal to white voters who are uncomfortable with the racist words and rhetoric coming from this president that he actually is not as racist as black voters think he is. According to the most recent Washington Post poll, more than 8 in 10 black voters think he's racist. And so what the president did last night was give people who are on the bubble a list of things that they can refer to when they are confronted with concerns about the president's racial insensitivities.
It'll be interesting to see if that strategy and that outreach works. Caitlin Huey-Burns and Eugene Scott, thank you both very much.